Natasha Kingsley is a 17-year-old girl whose family is about to get deported to Nigeria. She is on a mission to fight for her home, to stay in the place where she grew up and has all of her memories. The movie starts with her standing in her room, with empty boxes that need to be filled with her things. She looks at the time and prepares to go to the immigration office. She is determined to try one last time for her family to be able to stay in the United States. She puts on her headphones and tells her parents that she is going to the immigration office. Her mother and father discourage her, saying they have already been to lawyers and have done everything they could, but it has been no use. Natasha is stubborn. Despite her parents' objections, she leaves the house. Natasha makes her way to the subway with the music buzzing in her ears and her jacket with the words "Deus Ex Machina" written on them. When she reaches the immigration office, she talks to one of the officials there, and he takes a look at her file. After asking her a few questions about her family, he asks her when her family is set to leave. Natasha tells him they are set to tomorrow. The man looks at her and apologizes, closing up her files. He tells her their case is out of their jurisdiction, and they cannot do anything about it now. Natasha is so disappointed that tears well in her eyes. She tells him that New York is her home and where she grew up. The man is a good person, so when he sees Natasha like this, he gives her a lawyer's number, whose name is Jeremy Martinez. He tells her he does pro bono work for immigrant families and might be able to help her. Natasha exits the building with renewed hope, sits on a staircase, and calls the number. The woman who picks up the phone is Martinez's assistant and is not very cooperative, but when Natasha insists, she tells her she can give her 15 minutes of Mr. Martinez's lunchtime. Natasha thanks the woman and hangs up. On the other hand, we see the life of a 17-year-old Korean boy named Daniel B. Daniel wakes up in his bed and starts his day by reciting some poetry. He writes down the words Deus Ex Machina in his little journal before he starts getting ready for his interview. Daniel's mother calls him to eat breakfast. Daniel's family wants him to be a doctor and to get into Dartmouth to uphold the family name. Daniel, however, does not want this. Nevertheless, he wears his suit and tie and goes to the kitchen, greeting his mother with a good morning. His mother forces him to practice what he would say during his interview, and Daniel endures until his older brother, Charlie, comes into the room. Charlie is older, but he is the family's disappointment. He has tattoos and piercings and works with his father at their shop. He has done nothing like going to college and making himself a career to be successful. So, when he starts teasing Daniel about being the good boy, his mother scolds him and sends him to the shop to help his father. Charlie leaves but forgets some money in a small bag. Daniel tells his mother he will take it to the shop, takes the bag from her, and leaves the house. He meets up with his friend on the subway, and they go to the central station to kill some time. While on the train stops for a few minutes. They all groan in disappointment, but the driver tells an inspiring story about how being late is not always bad and tells them to open up their hearts to destiny. This touches Daniel, as he, himself, is a poetic person. They climb stairs to a place high up, where they can gaze upon different people in the station. This is where Daniel sees Natasha for the first time. While looking down at people, Daniel notices a girl looking up at the constellations painted on the roof of the station. Natasha is thinking about all the times her father brought her here when she was younger and how they used to look at these constellations like they were looking at stars. When she turns around to leave, Daniel sees Deus Ex Machina written on her jacket. He sees it as fate and remembers what the driver had said. He tells his friend he has to find the girl. He runs downstairs and looks for her, but she has already left. His friend leaves for his shift, and Daniel promises to call him later as he also catches a train for his interview. Whilst on the train, he thinks about the girl he has seen. Just as the train is about to come to a stop, he spots someone with an afro that looks familiar in the cabin next to his. Daniel stands up to get a better look and is elated to see that it is the same girl he has seen. He follows her off the train and all the way to the streets where she walks, fascinated by this person his destiny was bringing him to. Daniel is still walking behind the girl when a rash driver crashes into a guy on a bicycle, and he falls at Daniel's feet. Daniel asks him if he's alright, but his attention goes to the girl who is about to get hit by the same car. He runs, and just before the car hits her, he pulls her back and they both fall to the ground, safely away from the car. Natasha looks at the boy who saved her and she looks surprised by his looks and his clothing. Daniel helps her up and Natasha thanks him for saving her life. He asks her if she would like to sit somewhere, and they end up sitting on the sidelines of a skate park. They sit there awkwardly until Natasha asks him about the journal he has in his hands. He tells her he writes poetry for fun. Natasha makes fun of him, guessing he must write about love. Daniel asks Natasha if she thinks love isn't real, and she tells him love is nothing but hormones, and humans give it a name to have something to stay alive for. Daniel bets her that he can make her fall in love with him. He tells her he can make her fall in love with him in a day. Natasha agrees, but gives Daniel only an hour because that's all she has before she has to meet up with the lawyer. Daniel takes her to a coffee shop, but Natasha's father calls her, so she takes the call outside. She tries to convince him that she's trying to give them a last chance. She argues for a while, with Daniel sitting inside the shop, staring at her from inside. Meanwhile, he gets a call of his own saying his interview has been delayed to the next day. Natasha comes back in and Daniel tells her about a study in which couples, who are strangers, ask each other a series of personal questions and then at the end of it, they stare into each other's eyes for 4 minutes. Natasha is skeptical, but she plays along and before she knows it, it's time to go to her meeting. Daniel accompanies her and when they reach the building, he realizes it's the same one where he had his own interview. Natasha tells him this is probably where they have to say goodbye, but Daniel tells her he'll find a way for them to meet again. Natasha smiles at him and goes inside the building. She meets with Martinez's assistant who tells her that he's been in an accident, so her meeting has been delayed. She tells her to fill out some forms. Natasha mostly answers falsely because she has to get her family to stay and she hands the papers to the woman after she is done. The assistant takes a look at the paper and tells Natasha that Martinez might be able to do something for her after all. Natasha thanks the woman for her kindness. She tells Natasha to come again at 4:30 sharp, and Natasha promises to be there. As Natasha enters the lobby, she is met by Daniel again. She is pleasantly surprised and happy to see him. Daniel asks her how it went and she tells him she has to be back in a few hours. Daniel convinces her to spend this time with him. Knowing this might be all the time she has with him, Natasha agrees, and instead of going home, she goes to Daniel's shop with him. Daniel has to give the bag of money to his father, so he decides to take Natasha with him. When Natasha sees the shop named Black Hair Ca, she is surprised. Daniel explains the history of how the Korean people got into the hair care business and eventually leads up to the trend reaching his family. They go inside, and Daniel shows Natasha all sorts of products. She picks up a pink dye, and Daniel teases her about having a huge pink afro. She asks him to touch her hair. What with his family being hair experts, he should be able to tell if they'll survive coloring them. He touches her hair gently, but their chemistry draws them closer. Just as they are about to kiss, Charlie shows up and interrupts them. He looks at both of them with suspicious eyes, and when Charlie starts to be racist toward Natasha, they almost break into a fight. Natasha pulls Daniel back. As they walk down the aisle, they bump into Daniel's father. Daniel gives his father the bag and introduces Natasha to his father. Mr. B tries to hand her a hair relaxer, but she politely declines, saying she likes her hair big. Before things can get any awkward, Daniel brings her out of there. Daniel apologizes to Natasha. She tells him she doesn't mind and that he shouldn't be ashamed of anything because he is nothing like his family. To cheer him up, Natasha takes Daniel to an astronomy exhibition. They look at meteors and 3D images of the first man on the moon. They sit in a theater and watch a documentary about the universe while holding hands. When they leave, they let go of all their worries and all of their pent-up energy. They share their first kiss under the sunlight in a park. Then, they take the subway, with Natasha resting her head on Daniel's shoulder, kissing and touching each other, not being able to keep their hands off each other. They take pictures in the middle of New York. Daniel decides to take Natasha to a karaoke club. They get a private room and talk about poetry. Natasha complains that almost all the poetry she has ever read is about love, intimacy, and the stars. No one ever wrote anything about the sun, but the sun is also a star. To distract her from the tragedy of poetry, Daniel takes off his coat and rolls up his sleeves, preparing to give the performance of a lifetime, while Natasha sits and watches. He sings her a gentle song. As Natasha sits and listens and she looks into Daniel's eyes, she imagines an entire future for the two of them if she stays. She imagines their young love growing old, going to amazing colleges together, getting married, starting a family with Daniel, taking their kids to see everything they saw, and reading bedtime stories together. As the song comes to an end, Natasha comes back to reality. Daniel comes to sit with her after the song. Not being able to help herself, she kisses him passionately. She wants to make the most of the time she has with him. They make out until her phone goes off and she snaps out of her daydream. She realizes she's almost late for her appointment with Martinez. Daniel runs after her, upset with the way she just left him there. He asks her what she's so afraid of, that she ran away from him like that. Natasha tells him she and her family are being deported back to Nigeria. Daniel is surprised and devastated when he hears this news. It isn't what he expected at all. He desperately asks her that there must be something they could do to stop this. With tears in her eyes, she thanks Daniel for saving her life and leaves. Daniel has no way of contacting her after this, nor does Natasha. She reaches the building at exactly 4:30 and manages to get the meeting with the lawyer, Martinez. He tells her he has read her file and he has fought for many families like hers. He tells her he'll have to talk to the judge who passed the decision to deport them. Once that is done, he tells her he'll arrange for permanent residence for her and her family. Natasha is elated and she feels like someone finally cares. Martinez tells her to meet him at 10 in the morning the next day to discuss her case. Natasha promises to be there. Now that she has hope that she may be staying in the United States after all, the first thing she wants to do is tell Daniel. She realizes she doesn't have any way to contact or to find him. The only thing she knows is where his shop is and she decides to go there. Meanwhile, Daniel goes to his shop after his tough breakup with Natasha. Charlie teases him and asks him why he looks so upset. When Daniel tries to ignore him, Charlie says something offensive to him about Natasha. This enraged Daniel and they both got into a fight. Before it can get too bad, Mr. B shows up and scolds Charlie for being the older one and hitting his brother. Charlie complains about always being blamed for everything. Mr. B tells Daniel to get some ice on his lip, which had been injured. Daniel sits in a corner room in his shop and suffers in silence with the knowledge that he might never see Natasha again. His father comes into the room and asks how he's doing. They talk about how important the family name is, and Mr. B tells Daniel that he has to go to Dartmouth and become a doctor to uphold the family name. They have an argument. Daniel tries to tell him that he doesn't want to be a doctor, but his father doesn't want to hear it. This leaves Daniel frustrated and unhappy about his life. He reminisces about the story of how his parents fell in love and unexpectedly moves to America. They did it for their children's future. He owes some of his life to them, but he is confused about how he could do what he loves and also make his parents happy. Tired of the whole situation, he leaves the shop, passing his brother on the way out. They say nothing to each other as Daniel leaves. A few minutes after Daniel leaves, Natasha shows up at the shop. She goes to the counter, where Charlie is serving customers with an injured face. She comments on his face, guessing he and his brother finally did manage to get into a fight. She asks Charlie for Daniel's number, because she can't find him anywhere. Charlie is surprised that she came all this way for his number. He asks her if she really likes him and she nods. He gives her Daniel's number and she thanks him, surprised at how easy this turned out to be. As she leaves, Charlie tells her not to break his brother's heart. She smiles and nods before leaving. Natasha calls Daniel and he picks up. When he hears her voice, life returns to his face. He asks her how she got his number. When she tells him Charlie gave her the number, he can't believe his ears. Natasha tells him she has some good news for him and asks Daniel to meet her. Daniel happily agrees. They meet up again, and this time, she tells him about what Martinez said. They walk around parks and go sightseeing, enjoying each other's company. They fall asleep in the park that night and neither of them goes home. When they wake up in the morning, Daniel tells her he could get used to waking up like this. They can't ignore the moment for long, though, because Daniel has to go for his interview and Natasha has to go to her appointment. They go to the same building again, and Natasha wishes Daniel good luck. Daniel goes in and keeps circling the door, just because he can't believe that she'll wait for him and that she'll still be here after his interview. She promises him she will be, and he finally goes inside. Daniel meets up with his interviewer, and he is the same lawyer who has helped Natasha, Martinez. Daniel doesn't know this, though. Martinez asks him a series of questions about his extracurricular activities and his academic achievements. So far, Daniel's profile looks perfect. But when Martinez asks him when he first realized he wanted to be a doctor, Daniel tells him he never wanted to be a doctor. He tells him he always wanted to be a poet. Martinez is curious, but accepts the answer. He asks Daniel why he wants to go to Dartmouth if he doesn't want to be a doctor. Daniel tells him this is for his parents, and for their family's name and honor. Whilst Daniel gives his interview, Natasha calls her mother, who has called her 15 times since she fell asleep last night. Her mother is panicked and worried sick about Natasha and orders her to come home at once. Natasha tries to explain that she needs some time because the lawyer might be able to do something so that they can stay in New York. Her parents tell her they have to catch a flight and they are getting late. Realizing she has too little time left, she hangs up the phone and rushes upstairs to Martinez's office. Martinez's assistant spots her and tells her that she is early. Natasha asks if Martinez is in his office and the assistant says yes, but as soon as she hears, Natasha runs to the office and bursts in without permission, before the assistant can stop her. When Natasha sees Daniel in the seat, she realizes she just ruined his interview. Daniel looks elated to see her though, and whispers Destiny, as though that explains why Natasha came to the office. Martinez is confused that both of these kids know each other, but he is also mad at Natasha for coming in before it was time and without permission. Natasha doesn't answer his question and just asks him if she and her family can stay in the United States. Martinez insists that he can't talk to her in front of Daniel, but she tells him that whatever he has to say, he can say in front of him. He stays silent for a few moments before giving her the bad news. He tells her he tries everything he could, but he couldn't find a way to keep her family in New York. Natasha is heartbroken, and she begins to cry. She complains to Daniel and Martinez that they promised this wouldn't happen and that she could stay in the country with her family. Knowing there is nothing more she can do and that she is out of time, Natasha runs out of the office. Daniel doesn't want to waste a second of his time in this interview and quits it, running after Natasha. When Martinez asks if Daniel wants his recommendation, Daniel tells him he doesn't want it as much as he wants the girl. He yells at Natasha to stop. She tells Daniel to go back to his interview when she sees him. She tells him to get over it. They met a day before, and she doesn't care about Destiny. She tells him he needs to go back to his interview and make a life for himself. She is still crying, and Daniel tells her he doesn't care about the interview. All he cares about is her, and he is here for her. He tells her he would like to meet his family and see where she resides, sleeps, and eats. Natasha agrees to show him her home. When they reach the house, Natasha's parents are livid at her for bringing a boy to the house and not having come home the entire night because of him. Natasha argues with her father and tells him Daniel is her guest. Natasha's father tells her that he loves her and that he wishes things were different, but they have to go now. She hugs her father and finally gives up her dream of staying in New York and spending the rest of her life there. Natasha flies to Nigeria and spends her life there. She decides to take up astronomy and studies there and makes friends. Meanwhile, Daniel goes to a community college and trains to become a chef. At first, Natasha and Daniel had kept in contact, but due to the time and space between them, they had drifted apart. Even then, Natasha found herself looking at their photographs of that one day they spent together and smiling, and Daniel found himself thinking about her, and looking, the same way she was doing when he saw her for the first time. Even as time passed, they did not forget one another. 5 years later, Natasha is doing her PhD in astronomy, and has finally come back to New York. She meets up with Martinez after many years at the same coffee shop that Daniel had brought her to. Her hair is longer and less wild, but still curly, and her face is a little different. Older. Martinez has aged as well, having gained a bit of weight and a beard. She asks him about Daniel and where she might be able to find him. Martinez tells her he wouldn't know. The day Daniel walked out of his office after her was the last day he ever saw her. He congratulates her on getting her PhD and tells her about his accident that had delayed their meeting. He tells her he had tried to convince the EMTs not to take him to the hospital, but he was glad that they did because his doctor has now become his wife. Natasha is happy for him, and this reminds her of Daniel and his theory of how fate brings people together. She thanks him for his time and he leaves. Natasha gets up and prepares to leave. She opens the door, but what she hears stops her in her tracks. There is someone in the coffee shop who is performing poetry. He says he is performing a poem about the sun. Natasha turns around and looks at Daniel after so many years. He is as handsome as he was, maybe more, and wears glasses now. He immediately recognizes her, and instead of saying his poem, he says her name. He walks towards her and greets her. Natasha compliments him on his glasses and he compliments her on her hair. Even after all those years, there is no hesitance, only comfort as they kiss each other, knowing destiny has united them again. This time, however, they have all the time in the world to do everything they dreamed of doing, together.